Hi there and welcome to The Wrap, simple news updates for busy people. Brought to you by myself, Verashni Pillay, and the team at Explained.co.za. Today we'll be looking at the big story about South Africa maybe just turning the corner on COVID-19. Can you believe it? Our take on how many sectors in our society are fighting back against COVID-19 corruption, plus a long take on justice being served and news briefs of news you need to know both here and abroad. So let's dive in. Now, last week we told you about a bunch of nasty cases of COVID-19 corruption. It's a dire state of affairs, so we're quite relieved to see that several different sections of our society are fighting back. And it's not just the normal government lip service either. President Zuma has appointed a cabinet committee to look into COVID-19 procurement, where all this dodgy stuff happened. Now, I know what you're thinking. Aren't cabinet committees the place where investigations go to die? Remember the cabinet committee set up to sort Eskom? Yeah, you don't remember it because it was that insignificant. On the bright side, this particular committee is being headed up by Justice Minister Ronald Lamola, and he is easily one of our country's most capable ministers. The Eskom one, on the other hand, was headed up by Deputy President David Mabiza, who is, well, maybe just a little bit less credible. In addition to this committee, the National Treasury is considering revamping the whole system by centralizing COVID-19 procurement so that individuals in the provinces and municipalities don't have as much wiggle room to slip their fingers into the cookie jar. Now, Treasury also wants all COVID-19 procurement to be done on an open tender basis. Now, this is the norm for how tenders should be done, and it stopped doing this because government was in an understandably a big rush to get hold of COVID-19 equipment, so they eased some of the usual checks and balances. But as we see, some people have taken advantage of that. Now, they're not the only ones trying to sort things out. Provincial leaders, where provinces have been badly hit by corruption around COVID-19 procurement, including Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, has seen the premiers of those provinces run lifestyle audits on their teams. And this is like on almost 1,000 people in some cases. This means if an official is driving a car or living a life their salary shouldn't be able to pay for, they're going to have some questions put to them. In addition, the Special Investigating Unit, the SIU, and this is a unit that's just dedicated to tracking misspent government money, and which actually does a fairly decent job of doing so, is looking into all COVID-19 contracts. And of course, there's organizations like the South African Council of Churches, the Desmond Tutu Foundation, and lots of others pushing back against the corruption. Now, as we've said before, you and other South Africans have every right to be skeptical, and we should be. But that said, the situation is awful, but we're no exception. Corruption is happening across the world when it comes to COVID-19 procurement, as Financial Mail has pointed out. Swaths of Latin America seems to be in the same boat as us. Cronyism and corruption are leeching COVID resources in the US too. There have been reports that 27 clients of Trump-connected lobbyists have received up to $10.5 billion of coronavirus relief funds. There's also this priceless example of a government tender gone terribly wrong in the US, in Texas specifically. According to ProPublica.org, which is an investigative news website, authorities in the US paid $7.3 million to a Texas company just 6 days after the company was formed, and was formed by an ex-telemarketer repeatedly accused of fraudulent practices. So they went and they bought a whole bunch of test tubes from this particular person and company, but when they arrived, they weren't test tubes. They were the plastic tubes that are turned into soda bottles, those 500 milliliter Coke bottles. They did not fit laboratory test tube racks, they're not sterile, and the plastic could have contaminated lab results. So that's how bad it's getting around the world, with people trying to make a quick, dishonest buck out of a global pandemic, and frankly, it's really sad. Now, this of course doesn't excuse or justify what's happening in South Africa, but we should know that this is a global problem, and at least we're trying to fight it. Moving on to the big story of the week, we've told you before about various breakthroughs that are happening in COVID-19 medical trials. And you're probably wondering, what's happened to all those trials you guys keep telling us about? Have they come to fruition? Well, one has proved to be really useful. It was around a very commonly used drug, whose name I'm not going to try to say because there's an X in it. But South Africa has plenty of this drug in supply. It's used for things like anti-inflammation, and we even have 3 major manufacturers of that particular medication. So It came into use around June in the country, and it's been doing the things. It seems to have helped us to avoid the worst. Fingers crossed. There's been a decrease in the rate of cases in South Africa recently, and this could mean that lockdown restrictions will be eased. This is according to the Sunday Times this past weekend. Now, look, all caveats must be included and observed, but as pieces of good news go, we'll take it. Now, experts are crediting this dramatic slowdown to South Africa's strict and early lockdown. In another positive sign, the recovery rate rose above 70% this week, helped by the use of this medication, which the Sunday Times says has reduced intensive care deaths by a quarter since it was introduced in June. I mean, think about that, a 25% reduction just from this common drug that we had all along. So it's a good thing, like I said, that we have 3 major suppliers of this medicine. In addition, South Africa's death rate is still half that of the global average. So for some reason, people who get sick from COVID-19 in South Africa don't die as much as they do in other countries. Now, of course, we must still be super, super cautious, right? Even though, according to the publication again, the Western Cape, Gauteng, and even the Eastern Cape may have already, fingers crossed again, passed their COVID-19 peaks. Can you believe it? Case numbers have been declining in those provinces, which just weeks ago saw hospitals reaching capacity. I'm sure you remember the horrible stories of just nurses and doctors on the edge, and especially just terrible situation in the Eastern Cape. And we're not excusing that, and we're not saying the worst is over, but we are saying that it looks like the numbers are starting to decline. Now, ENCA has also reported that, according to Health Minister Zweli Mkhize, the country's peak overall could be over by, wait for it, the end of August. Could we have a September with some alcohol in it? A spring where we can have cocktails? That would be amazing. Now, another experimental drug, whose name I'm also not going to try to pronounce, but it starts with an R, has been shown to reduce hospital time for COVID-19 patients, and that arrived in South Africa at the end of July. Experts are hoping it will be instrumental in reducing our rate of hospitalization too. Now remember, all this medication is just to help alleviate the symptoms, very severe symptoms of bad COVID-19 cases. It won't protect you at all from the virus. There is no cure for the virus and no preventative measures yet, besides washing your hands and staying at home. So while we could all use some good news, it's really important to keep things in perspective. Infections still appear to be on an upward trajectory in other provinces, and we have to bear that in mind, that, while we might be seeing the wave starting to slow down, there could be another wave. In fact, there probably will be. We've seen that in other countries, another second and sometimes even third wave and more hits. So before you pop the champagne that you hopefully bought before the lockdown, Mkhize has warned that a second wave is likely if the country starts acting irresponsibly. So keep on social distancing, keep wearing those masks, and keep washing your hands, even with your fingers crossed. Okay, moving on to a really cool section that we sometimes visit now and then, where we talk about accountability happening in our society and justice being served. Jacob Zuma has had to say sorry to Derek Hanekom. Now, this is like an ongoing thing here at The Wrap. There's always someone defeating Jacob Zuma in court lately. It's kind of amazing. And he's had his latest serving of justice. Now, Zuma, of course, being our former president, he finally issued an apology to former Tourism Minister Derek Hanekom over a tweet in which Zuma called Hanekom a known enemy agent. Now, a little bit of background. Hanekom was one of a handful of ministers that were in Zuma's cabinet when he was president, but that he fired after they were critical of his relationship with the Guptas. If you can remember those days, those horrible state capture days, not many people were willing to stand up to Zuma, but Hanekom did try in his own way. Now, Zuma sent the tweet last year when he was no longer president after claims by EFF leader Julius Malema that the EFF had met with Hanekom to plan Zuma's ousting at the worst of Zuma's reign in the ANC. Now, Hanekom has denied that happened, but nonetheless, this whole court thing happened because Zuma went ahead and called him an agent. Now, the Constitutional Court has effectively confirmed on Friday that Zuma defamed Hanekom and that he must apologize and remove the tweet. Can you imagine that? How many times have you been insulted on social media? You could go to court and get those tweets removed. Anyway, Zuma was, as you can imagine, very reluctant. He missed the deadline the court imposed upon him to have that tweet deleted, and Hanekom's lawyer had to ask him to do it. So he finally did it, but he posted the tweet in isiZulu and said that he was only saying this because he was instructed to say it, and then quoted verbatim the apology he was told to make, and afterwards he added, "I hope I say it according to his wishes and court orders." Salty much? Hanakam also wants Zuma to pay 500,000 Rand in damages for the harm caused by the tweet, but the court has not decided on that one yet. Ouchie. More justice being served. The Guptas can run to Dubai, but they can't hide. Justice may finally be coming for the infamous family, or at least for their pockets. Last week, Eskom, well, at least the current leaders at Eskom and the Special Investigating Unit, which I mentioned earlier, said that they would be going after the Gupta brothers and their former friends who used to be in charge at Eskom for more than, wait for it, 3 billion Rand that was estimated to have been looted from the state and from Eskom specifically. Now, we have a deep dive around that where we explain it in more detail, and I'll drop that link below the podcast if you're interested. But wait, there's more accountability. The NPA and the Zondo Commission have teamed up. Until now, the National Prosecuting Authority has appeared hamstrung by a lack of financial forensic talent, making it unable to pursue corruption and crimes related to state capture. But the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture, which has a bigger budget and technical capacity, has now signed up to share crucial information with the country's prosecutors in a move that could see these sticky corruption cases finally getting the attention they deserve. Now, we've spoken about this before, about how the NPA is trying to rebuild itself, but it's just very, kind of depleted and doesn't have enough resources and can't actually arrest people and bring charges against them because they're afraid those charges will just get thrown out in court because they don't have the teams to put together a really killer, closed book case. Meanwhile, the Zondo Commission has loads of resources but hasn't got prosecuting authority, so they can collect all this evidence but they can't actually put these people in jail. So bringing these two together, we think, is a long overdue and wonderful idea. This means that the NPA can access the infamous Gupta leak emails, which they weren't able to access until now, and only the Zondo Commission had access to. So we personally cannot wait for the rest to finally begin. Moving on to some other news briefs from South Africa and around the world. The ANC might be changing its mind over leaving the International Criminal Court, which was a really stupid decision that was taken under, you guessed it, Jacob Zuma. And Ramaphosa might be trying to undo that. Now, a quick background on this one. The International Criminal Court does what its name says, and it had an arrest warrant out on Omar al-Bashir while he was in South Africa at an AU summit in 2015. Now, if you're wondering who Bashir is, he was the former leader of Sudan and quite the tyrant. I won't get into it, but basically a war criminal. Now, global politics and thin skins being what they are, African leaders decided to close ranks, and South Africa refused to arrest him at the time, going so far as to table a bill in our parliament to withdraw from the ICC. Because nothing says we love justice than saying screw you to the ICC, right? Anyway, thankfully, the bill never made much headway, and now we know why. Ramaphosa is not so keen on it, and has tactfully noted that neither is the rest of the continent anymore. He apparently told a private meeting of the ANC's top leadership that the rest of the continent has abandoned this position, leaving South Africa isolated. He also threw in some hot issues the country under the ANC wants to keep an eye on at the ICC, such as supporting Palestine in apparently bringing a case against Israel and supporting Venezuela and doing the same against the US. Again, you need to be at the table in order to participate in these decisions. Unfortunately, Ramaphosa's decisions and comment are subject to that eternal ANC problem, factions. Expect further paralysis on this issue, but at least we won't be leaving the ICC anytime soon. Moving on to some exciting, nice news. Even a corona apocalypse, which is a phrase that my sub-editor just coined, can't keep South Africa's sportsmen and women down. There's a guy called Brad Bindler. He's in his early 20s, and he became the first South African to ever win a MotoGP. And if you don't know what a MotoGP is, neither did I, and I looked it up, and it's the ultimate in global Grand Prix motorcycle racing. Now, Brad crossed the finish line at the Czech Grand Prix of the weekend, prompting a shout-out from the president himself, who said that Brad's victory lifts the spirit of the nation at a time we need this. Preach, that's certainly the case. And now, South Africa might be having its first digital census as early as next year. Now, we're due for a new national headcount, and next year will be the first time the census gets done digitally, at least in part. Stats South Africa has just started putting the new system through its paces for the first time. It hopes to reach 300,000 in this practice run, but so many of us still don't have internet access, so the Stats SA prefects will be out and about taking register on paper too for those who can't do it digitally. This is great news, as more reliable data drawn digitally means better understanding our needs as a country and figuring out solutions. On to some media news. Daily Maverick, the publication, is going to go print. Talk about going against the grain. We guess it's in their name, the Maverick, but at least. While several news and print publications have closed down thanks to the pandemic, and this is across the world, popular news website here in South Africa, Daily Maverick, is launching a weekly newspaper. They're calling it Daily Maverick 168. The team says that research shows that its audiences want a beautiful publication that they can page through once a week. The newspaper will have a cover price of just 20 Rand, but will be available for free to pick and pay smart shoppers, cardholders on Saturdays. So that's quite the deal. More media news, and this one's a bit depressing. Radio legend Bob Mabana has died. Now, Bob Mabana was station manager at Power FM most recently, and I'm very sad to say, my former boss when I was at Power FM. Now, Mabana died over the weekend. He was just 51 and is understood to have passed away from a cardiac arrest. Now, he really is a legend. He started his radio career at just 19 in 1989 at the now defunct Radio Bop before making a splash at nearly every major radio station after that. His name became synonymous with the song Get Funky after he co-recorded the smash hit song in the 90s with Kaiser Chiefs superstar Dr. Kamala. His death was met with waves of tributes, including from the president himself. The president was really busy this week. But on a personal note, he was a really wonderful gentleman, and he's going to be greatly missed. And it's just a really crappy piece of news and a crappy year. So moving on, everything you need to know about disinfecting. Should you disinfect all your apples individually? Should you install a disinfectant tunnel for visitors to keep the virus at bay? It's easy to go overboard if you are a germaphobe with all these scary stories of the virus, which is why we really like a helpful list of do's and don'ts written by a collective of some of the country's top scientists. We've again included the link to this in the box below this podcast, so check it out if you're wondering what are the do's and don'ts when it comes to disinfecting. Onto some international news. Corrupt governments of the world, take note. In a world where accountability in politics seems as unlikely as a cure for Covid-19, Lebanon stunned the world this week when its entire cabinet resigned. More than 200 people were killed in the explosion last week, which devastated the port, causing billions in damage and economic losses, and sparked concerns of a humanitarian crisis, with many left homeless. And after the initial shock faded, a sea of protesters took to the streets, blaming Lebanon's leaders for the blast through their alleged negligence and corruption, the BBC reported. Now, the explosion happened after over 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, a chemical used both in fertilizer and powerful explosives, was stored for 6 years without safety measures at the capital's port in Beirut and detonated. Now, the story of how the explosive material ended up stored near the port in the first place is a dizzying account of bureaucratic bumbling. But wow, the entire cabinet resigning. Can you imagine that happening here? Well, that's it from us at The Wrap. In terms of the week ahead, the regulations governing the reopening of schools will be gazetted this week according to Business Day, hopefully providing some clarity over school closures. Last week, the government closed schools for the second time since the start of the pandemic, and public schools are supposed to stay closed until August 24th. However, grades 12 and 7 are meant to return to school on Monday. That's it for us. We'll chat to you again next week. For now, goodbye from me.